Hi guys! This is the third part of the video. Test your knowledge, theories of personality. Bawal mag-skip ha! If hindi mo pa nasisimula ng first and second part, I've provided the links in the description box below para sa'yo. Now, let's continue sa third round ng test. Number 51. According to Erikson, the ego is the blank. A. Center of personality. B. Center of consciousness. C. Center of the unconscious. Or D. Center of identity. And the correct answer is letter A. Center of personality. So this is just a question of fact. And it's just stated in the book itself na if you have not read the book, it will be different to deduce. But according to Erikson, the ego is the center of personality. And it's centered around his theory na psychosocial crisis na may mga basic strengths and basic weaknesses. He was referring to the basic strengths and basic weaknesses of the ego. And yung letter B, center of consciousness, that's Carl Jung. Because again, ang emphasis ni Carl Jung is collective unconscious and the archetypes. And the center of personality for Carl Jung is not the ego, but the self, the unifying archetype. That's the center of personality. The center of consciousness for Carl Jung is the ego. Erikson identified three interrelated aspects of the ego, except A. Body ego, B. Ego ideal, C. Conscience, or D. Ego identity. And the correct answer is letter C. Conscience. So again, this is just a question of definition. Tinatanong lang natin dito kung ano yung definition ni Erikson sa ego, and what he did was he divided it into three parts. First is the body ego. You can feel your body right now, right? You can sense your hand moving, your feet moving, whatever. You can feel yourself breathing. That's the body ego. Your sense of your own body. Ego ideal, from the word ideal, who you think you should be. That's the ego ideal. And the other one is ego identity, is who you think you are. Which of the following conditions is necessary and sufficient for therapeutic growth to occur? A. Unconditional positive regard. B. Congruence. C. Empathic listening. Or D. All of the above. And the correct answer is letter D. All of the above. So, unconditional positive regard is accepting the person for who she is. Kasi one of the concepts of Rogers is what we call conditions of worth. Na feeling mo acceptable ka lang as a human being kapag nakapasa ka ng board exam, or naging top-notcher ka, or graduate ka ng college. And one of the observations of Rogers is yung mga patients niya is they have a lot of this. And the more na may conditions of worth ka, the more na may discrepancy between your ideal self and your real self. And the more na nagkakaroon ng behavioral problems. Another is congruence. So, this is the quality of the therapist. So, dapat yung therapist ay honest. Hindi siya pwede na okay ka lang ng okay sa sinasabi ng pasyente mo, yung tanggap kita kung sino. Because that's not what is a healthy relationship. Healthy relationship is founded on honesty. A therapist must be congruent. If what your patient said angered you or annoyed you, you must be able to express that properly and appropriately. Na hindi ka nagpapanggap sa harap mismo ng patient. And empathic listening is gets mo yung emotional content ng person. So you're not just talking at the person. You're talking to the person, and you're actually listening on where the person is coming from. In terms of motivation, Maslow emphasized the importance of blank motivation, while Allport emphasized blank motivation. A. Conscious-unconscious. B. Unconscious-conscious. C. Conscious-conscious. Or D. Unconscious-unconscious. And the correct answer is letter B. Unconscious-conscious. So with Maslow, he acknowledged the complexity of human motivation. And again, makikita mo yun sa kanyang hierarchy of needs, kung saan sinasabi niya na universal naman ang needs ng tao. And we're not always aware of this. Maybe ngayon, nagpapaganda ka, sasabihin mo sa sarili mo, nagpapaganda ako para sa sarili ko. But for Maslow, he might say, oh, you're just have this unconscious need for love and belongingness, and you think being beautiful would make you feel more loved and would make you feel like you belong. Beauty is a concept of society, and pag maganda ka, syempre, mas may approval ka with your peers and with others. But for Allport, tatanggapin niya yun at face value. Allport would just say, okay, kasi feel mo lang para sa sarili mo, gusto mo lang magpaganda. Okay, sige, make up ka dyan. That's Allport. And makikita mo to naman sa concept ni Allport na functional autonomy. So when we say functional autonomy, for instance, nag-exercise ka. Ngayon, kada nag-exercise ka, nire-reward ka ng parents mo ng 2K. O, di ba? Laki. Ng 2K ka, mag-exercise ka lang, di ba? And over time, kahit tanggalin na ng parents mo yung reward na 2K, nag-exercise ka pa din. Because it feels good. Naging functionally autonomous siya. Kasi, yung motivation mo to do the thing, nawala na, pero ginagawa mo pa rin yung behavior. And that's usually happens in a conscious level. Sasabihin sa'yo ni Allport, nag-exercise ka kasi trip mo lang. Okay. Accepted. The need to comb one's hair is an example of A. Instinctoid need, B. Non-instinctoid need, C. Neurotic need, or D. Cognitive need. And the correct answer is letter B. Non-instinctoid need. So, when we say instinctoid need, yung need dito, hindi siya yung define na that which you cannot do without. But, it's one way to explain behavior na merong iba't ibang needs na tinawag si Maslow. So, one of them is instinctoid need, again, yung physiological needs, security needs, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and self-actualization. Those are instinctoid needs. If instinctoid needs are frustrated, they lead to pathology. So what happens when the needs on the triangle are not met? So may mga nagre-result na pathology like depression or criminal behavior and things like that. And if you satisfy that list in that triangle, they lead to psychological health. But for non-instinctoid need, it's not the case. So kahit naman hindi ka magsuklay, hindi ka naman ganun magiging pathological. But if na-frustrate ka, as in sobrang na-frustrate ka dahil hindi ka nagsuklay, it might be an expression of one of the instinctoid needs. Okay? So, yun yung one of the complexities of this is, if na-frustrate ka and medyo bad trip ka kasi hindi ka nakapagsuklay, that's because inherent in that need is your need for love and belongingness. But you can't say na you need to comb your hair. It's actually the need for love and belongingness. And it's just a temporary satisfaction. Again, ganda ng buhok mo, di ba? But it's not necessarily leading to psychological health. And again, ganoon din yung cognitive need. When we say cognitive need, yun yung needs dun sa triangle. And when we say naman neurotic need, when you satisfy that neurotic need, for instance, may neurotic need ka to save. Right? Hindi siya productive. Analogical siya kay Sullivan na sa tensions, merong need and anxiety. So yung need, yun yung mga cognitive need. Yung anxiety, yun yung parang neurotic need na kahit isatisfy mo siya, does not lead to psychological health. And ang pinaka-example nito ay yung OCD. Blank is often an end in itself and has no other purpose than to be A. Coping behavior, B. Artistic behavior, C. Expressive behavior, or D. Playful behavior. And the correct answer is letter C. Expressive behavior. So, wala namang artistic behavior, playful behavior. In Maslow's terms, we only have coping and expressive behavior. When we say coping behavior, it's the behaviors that you do in order to meet the instinctoid needs. So, kumari, kumakain ka. That's a coping behavior. Kasi kailangan mo yun to meet your physiological need. Whereas, expressive behavior is just how you do it, how you do things. Wala siyang purpose. So, maybe, nagtatalon-talon ka lang dyan, kumakanta-kanta ka. Yun. That's an example of expressive behavior. Maslow hypothesized that when people's blank are not met, they suffer an existential illness. A. Artistic needs, B. Meta needs, C. Cognitive needs, or D. Aesthetic needs. The correct answer is letter B. Meta needs. Artistic needs, walang ganyan. It's not a concept of Maslow. Cognitive needs is your need to know. Aesthetic needs is your need for beauty. So that's one of the needs embedded in self-actualizing people. And cognitive needs is one of the most fundamental because unless you try to know, you will not survive. But when we're asking about existential illness, it happens when you do not practice the B values, You're not living your life with truth, beauty, and the virtues, courage, and justice, and things like that. That's what we call the meta needs. Your need to express those things. For Maslow, it results in existential illness. So it's just a question of definition. Blank are the basic innate units of motivation. A. Urges. B. Sentiments. C. Traits. Or D. Energy transformations. And the correct answer is letter A. Urges. So, ang pinagkaiba lang ng urges and sentiments is yung urges ay fundamental. It's like hunger and thirst. Hindi siya nawawala. It always motivates the person. No matter, sa buong buhay mo, mamamotivate ka niya. And for sentiments, ito naman yung nawawala. Let's say, religion. Maybe yung attitude mo ngayon is hardcore Christian ka. And somehow, at some point in your life, naging Muslim ka. Or maybe naging atheist ka. So, nawala siya. Or maybe your hobbies, like tennis. Maybe mahilig ka mag-tennis. And then, nag-quit ka mag-tennis. Nawala siya. So, that's an example of sentiments. Nawawala yung positive or negative attitude mo. Nawawalan ka na ng paki. It no longer matters. It no longer motivates. For traits, these are patterns of behavior. And meron iba't ibang traits si Cattell, which I will not elaborate in this part. Kasi mapapahaba tayo. And energy transformations, this is a concept of Sullivan. These are the behaviors resultant from the tension. So tension are potential for action. Energy transformations are the actions themselves. The Rorschach ink blot test is an example of A. T data, B. Q data, C. L data, or D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter A. T data. So when we say T data, again, ang pinagkaiba lang naman sa Q data is that Q data is self-report. So anything na hindi self-report, like projective test, again, nag-judge ka, ginajudge mo yung cards ni Rorschach, pero hindi mo naman alam yung meaning ng judgments mo. It's the clinician who interprets that. That's an example of T data. Or maybe Waze or Stanford Binet, intelligence as you're trying to answer questions na you may not know kung ano yung tamang sagot. You're not being relied upon to get the measurement, but rather the interpretation na in-establish mismo nung gumawa ng test. Q data, self-report. So a Q. So like Neopie, when you're self-reporting your behaviors, like I usually eat a lot, or I like going outside, I like talking to people. You're telling the clinician about who you are. That's an example of Q data. And L data is, it comes from others. So, kuwari, tinanong ng clinician yung friend mo on what they think or who they think you are. So, that's an example of L data. According to Eysenck, which of the following factors is not included in the normal personality structure? A. Neuroticism, B. Psychoticism, C. Extraversion, or D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter D. None of the above. So, ang way to remember Eysenck's normal personality structure, we call that the Penn model. So, psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism, and each of them has polar opposites. For neuroticism, it's emotional stability. For psychoticism, it's superego. And for extraversion, it's introversion. For Eysenck, the emphasis is on biology. He claimed that most of our personality is determined by biological factors. Introverts tend to have blank, while extroverts tend to have blank. A. High level of cortical arousal, low level of cortical arousal. B. Low level of cortical arousal, high level of cortical arousal. C. Low sensory threshold, high sensory threshold. Or D. None of the above. The correct answer is letter A. Introverts, they have high level of cortical arousal. Again, Eysenck is biological, so he's claiming that this is embedded in our brains, and specifically to cortical arousal. So, and it has low, and the introverts have low levels of sensory threshold. And for extroverts, it's the opposite. Extroverts have low level of cortical arousal, and they have high sensory threshold. As a result of this, introverts tend to choose routine activities like reading, playing computer games, or something na hindi masyadong extreme. Like, it doesn't involve going outdoors na aakyat ka ng bundok or magsa-skydiving ka, those are typical extroverts behavior. And ang typical metaphor dito, ang way na makalala ko dito sa nung nagre-review ako is parang tao na mahina ang pandinig. Kung sobrang lakas ng pandinig mo, syempre ayaw mo sa mga maiingay kasi ma-overwhelm ka. Right? So, ganun ang introverts, malalakas ang pandinig. So, konting stimulation lang, konting sound lang, nakukuha na, okay na, satisfied na. Whereas, ang mga extroverts, mahihina ang pandinig. Right? It's just an analogy, ha? So, mahihina yung pandinig ng mga extroverts. So, kailangan nila ngayon ng mga loud places para masatisfy yung need nila to hear. But of course, this is about cortical arousal na. Since high level na yung cortical arousal mo, konting stimulation lang, okay ka na. Whereas, dahil extroverts, yung mga extroverts, mababa yung level of cortical arousal, kailangan mo ng mataas na stimulation para ma-stimulate ka. A student from RGO is reading his book on theories of personality even before the review starts. What level of behavior is being described above? A. Type, B. Trait, C. Habitual act, or D. Specific act. The correct answer is letter D, specific act. So kung sinabi natin na lagi niya itong ginagawa, gabi-gabi, it's an example of a habitual act. Right? But since isang instance lang yung tinatanong dito, if sinabi ko na gabi-gabi niya ito ginagawa, lagi siya nagbabasa, it's an example of a habitual act. But since it's just one specific instance, it's a specific act. So we have 4 levels. We have the specific acts, habits, traits, and types. So yung types, since this is Eysenck, types is the Penn model. So extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism, or maybe introversion. And traits yung summary ng habits. So for instance, lagi kang lumalabas and you love talking to people, so it could be an outgoing trait. But then, if you mix outgoing with looking for high stimulation and other traits, magiging na siyang type. That's what we call extraversion. Number 63. If a rat who learned how to run a maze to get its food continues to run the maze despite feeling satiated, Allport will say that this is an example of A. Perseverative functional autonomy, B. Appropriate functional autonomy, C. Proprium, or D. None of the above. And the correct answer is letter A. Perseverative functional autonomy. So functional autonomy is when a motive, the initial motive for an act, stops to be the motive for doing it. So, yun nga, yung example, na yung rat, una, para lang kumain, pero kahit busog na siya, tinatapos pa rin yung maze. So, ano na yung motivation niya to finish the maze? Siyempre, hindi na para kumain kasi busog na. It's something else altogether. So, it becomes functionally autonomous. It's free from the initial motive. Now, what's the difference between appropriate and perseverative? Pinagkaiba lang nila is, when we say appropriate, it comes from the concept proprium, which is central to your identity. So maybe, psychology major ka. So, una, nagbabasa ka para pumasa ng college. Pero dahil na-assimilate mo na sa identity mo na psychology major ka and psychometrician, nagbabasa ka pa rin ng psychology books. Although wala na siyang grades. So, it would be an example of appropriate functional autonomy. Because it's close to who you are. Let's suppose, nag-exercise ka. And then, ang reward una, dahil mahilig ka magbasa ng books, binibigyan ka ng books. Nire-reward mo yung sarili mo through buying books every time na nag-exercise ka. But then, hindi ka na bumibili ng books pero nag-exercise ka pa din. That's an example of perseverative functional autonomy. Openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism is an example of A. Basic tendencies, B. Characteristic adaptation, C. Objective biography, or D. Self-concept. And the correct answer is letter A. Basic tendencies. Eysenck focused mostly on biology. But for Costa and McRae, they integrated in their theory the other factors, environmental factors. It begins with biological, and then as a result of that biology, genetics and all that, basic tendencies. And these basic tendencies would shape our characteristic adaptation. So, for instance, high in openness ka. then most likely you're doing something creative. So yun yung characteristic adaptation mo, naging artist ka. That's characteristic adaptation. Which of course would affect your self-concept, which includes your personal myths and your objective evaluation of who you are. And then, mag-i-influence din ito yung objective biography mo. Because syempre, dahil nga yung characteristic adaptation mo, ito yung maging tendencies mo, it would affect also the external influences, your culture, right? In one way or another. It has this back and forth influence with one another. So, your characteristic adaptation influences your objective biography, and your objective biography influences your characteristic adaptation. And I think one example nito is, again, kung may characteristic adaptation ka na resilient ka, dahil mababa ang neuroticism mo, emotionally stable ka. And then, yung objective biography, bumagyo. Pero dahil resilient kang tao, emotionally stable ka, kaya mo siya psychologically harapin. So, may mga ganong interaction. So, you can check out this model in Feist and Feist book, yung may kita may interrelation ng model ni Costa and McRae. But that's the major difference between Eysenck and McRae. Is that McRae involved the influences of the environment of the person sa theory niya. Which of the following is not a core component of personality? A. Basic tendencies. B. Characteristic adaptation. C. Objective biography. Or D. Self-concept. And the correct answer is letter C. Objective biography. Kapag sinabing core, nasa siya, innermost, diba? So, when we're talking about the person, we're talking about the core component. Una, yung basic tendencies mo, yung traits, yung ocean. Pangalawa, yung characteristic adaptation, yung mga hobbies mo, yung mga opinions mo sa mundo. And pangatlo, characteristic adaptation din to. Pero nilagyan lang nila ng separate content, which is the self-concept. So everything else outside that, outside the person, like biology, right, is a result of genetics, out of your control, peripheral yan. Objective biography, yung what happens sa'yo, nangyayari sa mundo, outside yun sa'yo, peripheral yan. Culture, well, hindi mo naman pinili kung saan kayo papanganak, kung anong kultura kayo papanganak, kung anong language yung matututunan mo nung bata ka, peripheral yan. So when it's outside you, way beneath you, way above you, that's peripheral. But when it's in you, like the ocean, the traits, and your adaptations and who you think you are, that's core. This postulate suggests that our responses are not always consistent with personal goals or cultural values. A. Development. B. Maladjustment. C. Individuality. Or D. Plasticity. And the correct answer is B. Maladjustment. So, yung mga component, yung core component and yung peripheral component, merong mga assumptions, which we call postulates. Like that which we accept without proving it. And one of the postulates of Costa and McRae was maladjustment. So, kunwari, depressed ka. Right? I mean, it's not in your interest to kill yourself, but then it usually happens with major depressive disorder, suicidal tendencies. It's not consistent with values of the culture and personal goals. Another is individuality. Individuality meaning, kakaiba tayong lahat. Although, pare-pareho tayo ng basic tendencies, ocean, magkakaiba tayo ng degrees of openness, magkakaiba tayo ng conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And kahit maging pare-pareho yun sa isang tao, like sa dalawang tao, magkaiba yung manifestation nila. Kuwari, pareho kayo ng level ng openness and conscientiousness. Pero, yung isa, naging painter, yung isa, naging musician. So, magkaiba sila ng manifestation. Individuality. Plasticity is just, well, people learn. Right? People change. And, medyo baluktot ang theory na hindi ina-acknowledge that people can change. Right? Because, what's the point of studying psychology if people cannot change? Right? And why would you even study it if, okay, depressed. Hayaan mo na yan. Depressed Di yan na magbabago. So we have to acknowledge plasticity. And development, well, from the word itself, develop. People develop over time. The following are postulates for basic tendencies except A. Individuality, B. Origin, C. Structure, or D. Plasticity. And the correct answer is letter D. Plasticity. So again, sinabi ko kanina yung core components, may iba't ibang postulates. And in Feist and Feist, nakikita mo na yung basic tendencies and yung characteristic adaptations lang yung diniscuss nilang postulates. So we will limit ourselves with that. And with the basic tendencies, here are the postulates. First, individuality. Adults have a unique set of traits that each person exhibits a unique combination of trait patterns. Again, sinabi ko nga, kahit pareho kayo ng level dun sa ocean, pareho kayo ng naging score sa NEUPI, magkakaiba kayo ng magiging combination and manifestation. Yan. Origin. All personality traits are the result solely of endogenous forces, such as genetics, hormones, and brain structures. In other words, family environment plays no role in creating basic tendencies. This is a basic tendency postulate, is that everything results from biology. Right? It's consistent with Eysenck. Costa and Bakray will tell you that basic tendencies is not personality. It explains a lot of our behavior. It will explain our characteristic adaptation and self-concept, as well as how we live our lives, which is objective biography, and it will also influence our culture. But it's not personality. The traits originate from biology, but personality is a result of interaction of core components and peripheral components. It's much broader than just the traits. Development. Traits develop and change through childhood, but in adolescence, their development slows. And by early to mid-adulthood, roughly the age of 30, change in personality nearly stops altogether. So development, well, again, as I've said earlier, people develop. Traits change over time, but it becomes relatively consistent kapag naging adult na. And it doesn't mean na hindi nagbabago ha. Again, traits lang yung nagiging consistent. Pero pwedeng magbago yung characteristic adaptation. So, kunwari, introvert ka. Pero yung expression ng introversion mo is medyo pathological. Meron kang sobrang mong mahiyain. Right? Sobrang mong mahiyain na hindi mo na nakukuha yung mga gusto mo. Nahihiya ka nang magtanong, nahihiya ka nang i-express yung sarili mo. That's an example of a characteristic adaptation that went wrong. And it will affect your self-concept, right? Magiging low self-esteem ka. But, kahit 30 years old ka na, pwede pa rin ma-fix yun. Introvert ka pa rin, pero we can reduce the shyness. Right? We can reduce the shyness, thereby making your life better. Gusto ko lang i-emphasize now, let's not limit our concept of personality sa traits when we talk about Costa and Bakray. It's the result of interactions across different components. And structure, traits are organized hierarchically from narrow and specific to broad and general, just as Eysenck had suggested. Which of the following theorists denied the existence of internal states, needs, motivation, instincts? A. Skinner, B. Freud, C. Maslow, or D. None of the above? And the correct answer is letter D. None of the above. Huh? What? Eh, di ba si Skinner? Behaviorist, di ba environment? Yeah, that's right. Si Skinner, sabihin niya sa'yo, huwag natin gamitin yung concept ng unconscious, yung instinct, or kung ano pa mang basic anxiety, or kung ano pa mang term na inimbento ng mga psychodynamic theorists, or ng humanistic. He rejected explanatory fictions. Like when we use needs and motivation to explain behavior. He rejected them as a way to explain why people behave. But he did not reject their existence. In fact, one of his opinions pa nga is yung sa dreams. Nag-agree pa siya kay Freud na dreams are wish fulfillments and they exist in symbolic forms. But not because of the unconscious forces, not because of a manifestation of the unconscious, but rather because dreams as a behavior has a reinforcement function. Because it rewards the individual. Yung mga bagay na hindi niya na-express sa real world because of the constraints, it becomes fully expressed in dreams. So it's explained through the reinforcement theory. But he did not deny them. He just denied using them as explanatory fictions. But he did not deny their existence. In classical conditioning, behavior is blank. While in operant conditioning, behavior is blank. A. Emitted, elicited. B. Elicited, emitted. C. Reinforced, punished. Or D. Punished, reinforced. And the correct answer is letter B. Elicited, emitted. So in classical conditioning, you pair a neutral stimulus to another. And then, it generates a response. Like, the classic experiment here is Pavlov's dog. So, every time na nagre-ring yung bell, binibigyan ng pagkain yung aso. And over time, natuto nang mag-salivate din yung aso dun sa bell. Kasi ina-assume na ng aso na after na marinig yung bell, may follow-up na food. And so, na-associate na niya na bell is food. Which was created by the stimulus response concept created by the experimenter. That's why it's called elicited. It comes from the environment. When we say emitted, again, imagine mo yung light, nag-i-emit ng light, yung bulb, nag-i-emit siya ng light. Right? It comes from within. Right? That's operant. For instance, na-reward ka. Right? Pumasa ka ng exam, and every time na pumapasa ka ng exam, nire-reward ka ng parents mo. So, ang ginawa mo, nag-take ka na ng mga exam. Next year, may bago ka na namang i-take na exam para makuha mo yung reward. So, nanggaling na sa'yo, ikaw na yung nag-initiate ng behavior. That's why it's emitted. Emit. Comes from within. The behavior comes from within in expectation of a response. And it's not reinforced punished kasi pareho naman silang may ganun. Reinforcement and punishment. Skinner preferred this reinforcement schedule because it is more resistant to extinction. A. Continuous. B. Intermittent. C. Variable ratio. Or D. Variable interval. And the correct answer is letter B. Intermittent. So when someone asks you about reinforcement schedule, dalawa lang naman talaga yan. Continuous and reinforcement. So continuous, every response, so every time na itaas mo yung kamay mo, nire-reward ka, nakukuha mo yung reward, or nakukuha mo yung reinforcement or punishment. When we say intermittent, it could be the 4-1, like variable ratio. Kapag variable ratio, hindi mo alam kung gaano karami. Minsan, pag nakalimang angat ka ng kamay, marereward ka. Minsan, 3, minsan, 1 lang. Iba-iba. Variable interval, minsan after 10 seconds, minsan after 15 seconds, pa-iba-iba na naman. When we say fixed interval, fixed naman every 10 seconds. Right? Every 10 seconds may reward, every 15 seconds may reward. Fixed ratio, every number of response except 1. Kasi kung every time lang ginagawa mong response, continuous na 'yon. Pero kunwari, bawat dalawang angat mo ng kamay, nakuha mo yung reward, or bawat 5, that's called fixed. Itong intermittent, ito yung preferred ni Skinner kasi nga, it's resistant to extinction. Specifically, it's the variable ratio. The reinforcement of a response increases the probability of all responses containing the same elements. This statement describes A. Operant discrimination, B. Stimulus generalization, C. Successive approximation, or D. Shaping. The correct answer is letter B. Stimulus generalization. So, when we say stimulus generalization, ang example nito, kuwari yung bata, no? Yung bata nakakita ng 4-legged animal, tapos tinawag mo sa kanya, that's a dog. Pero nung sunod na nakakita siyang 4-legged animal, kahit cat na yon, sinabi pa rin niya, dog. Kasi nagamit niya yung stimulus na 4-legged animal as dog. So, that's an example of stimulus generalization. And then, operant discrimination naman is you're discriminating from the stimulus. So, na-identify mo naman yung differences. So, kunwari, alas 7 na. Typical sa bahay nyo kumakain ng alas 7. Kahit hindi ka natawagin, bababa ka. I-expect mo may pagkain na. So, nagiging ulit-ulit yung behavior. Pero dahil wala ka sa bahay nyo, alas 7 na, syempre, kunwari, nasa taas ka, second floor ng bahay ng tropa mo, hindi ka bumaba. Kasi wala ka naman sa bahay nyo. That's an example of operant discrimination. Successive approximations naman is yung nire-reward mo yung behavior as it progresses. Kasi ang assumption is that behavior tend to be complex. From simple to complex. So kung gusto mong turuan maglakad yung bata, simulan mo muna turuan mag-crawl. Tapos pa nagko-crawl, i-reinforce mo yon. Tapos habang tinatry niyang tumayo, kapag tumayo na siya, reward mo na naman yung pagtayo. And then habang lalakad na siya, i-reward mo yung pagtayo, yung paglakad. So na-shape mo na siya. A complex motor movement arising from simple ones. So that's shaping. Which of the following statements is or are true? The control of human behavior is better served by reinforcement than punishment. Punishment allows us to accurately predict behavior. One effect of punishment is to suppress behavior. Reinforcement allows us to accurately predict behavior. A. 1, 2, 3. B. 1, 3, 4. C. 2, 3, 4. or D, 1, 2, 4? And the correct answer is letter B, 1, 3, 4. 2 is incorrect because what happens is kapag pinunish mo ang isang behavior, kunwari yung bata, kumain ng maraming candy, tapos pinalo nung magulang. So ang tendency is, mapre-predict mo na hindi nakakain ng maraming candy yung bata. But, hindi mo mapre-predict kung ano yung papalit doon. You just know that the child will suppress that behavior. Right? The child would stop doing it. Whereas, kapag na-reinforce mo naman, let's say, sumunod sa'yo yung bata. And then, ni-reward mo siya for being obedient. So, alam mo na sa sunod mong utos, more likely than not, since ni-reward mo siya in the past, na susunod siya. So, it allows you to predict much more accurately. So, yun yung difference ng reinforcement and punishment. Sa punishment, hindi mo alam kasi kung ano yung papalit. That's why it's much better to reinforce correct behaviors than punish the wrong ones. Which of the following is not a generalized reinforcer? A, money, B, approval, C, attention, or D, none of the above? And the correct answer is D, none of the above. When we say generalized reinforcer, these kinds of reinforcers are associated with a lot of rewards. For instance, attention. Kasi nung bata ka, nung binigyan ka ng attention ng magulang mo, you get comfort. Dahil nga binibigyan ka ng attention, kinakarga-karga ka, kinakausap ka, and it's reinforcing. Pero, you can also get food. So, nasasatisfy yung hunger mo, binibigyan ka rin ng inumin, ng gatas. So maraming different reinforcements na kailangan attention, related siya sa attention. So that's why it's a generalized reinforcer. And ganoon din siya sa approval. And for money naman, again, pag may pera ka, ang dami mong kayang gawin na rewarding para sa'yo. Pwede kang pumunta kung saan mo gusto in a much more convenient way sa halip na lakarin mo. So maraming ways to get rewarded for it. So it becomes a generalized reinforcer. Playing slot machines is an example of A, fixed ratio, B, variable ratio, C, fixed interval, or D, variable interval. And the correct answer is letter B, variable ratio. Again, you don't know how many times kung gaano mo karami dapat magsaksak ka dyan ng coins tapos i-roll yung machine para makuha mo yung reward. But it cannot be variable interval. Why is that? Because when we say variable interval, you don't have to do anything. Like, there's no expected response. Maybe nakaupo ka lang dun sa slot machine, tapos after 5 minutes, may reward ka na. But it doesn't work that way. Kailangan i-start mo yung machine na mag-roll siya, na mag-insert ka ng coin and everything. So, may expected response ka dapat na gawin bago mo makuha yung reinforcement. So, it's variable ratio. In all instances of operant conditioning, all these conditions must be present except A, antecedent, B, behavior, C, defenses, or D, consequent. And the correct answer is letter C, defenses. Again, A, B, C, D siya, no? So, una, kailangan mo yung antecedent. Kailangan mo ng stimulus, which would result in a behavior, in a particular behavior. And yung behavior na yun may consequence. Either you are rewarded or punished. Pero kailangan mo yung ABC for operant conditioning. Kasi again, kung walang behavior, walang consequence. May confusing ba na questions or explanations na gusto nyong ipaklarify? Comment down below para ating mapag-usapan. Then, click the link in the description box below for the next part of our test. Or, click here! See you there!